This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode, I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 344 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Today we're talking about learning languages and making mistakes. Firstly, I'd love to pay my respects to the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, where I'm recording this podcast today. So, learning languages is, I think, a lot of fun. I have dabbled in quite a few languages over my lifetime. I don't know, it just suits my brain. I love doing it. I love watching subtitled Netflix shows. I love exploring new languages when I'm going to be visiting the country. I love finding out about unusual sounding words, all sorts of things. I don't love grammar, and you'll find out more about that later in this episode. But my most, let's say, closest to fluent foreign language is German. I learnt German all through school, university, and lived there for a few years as well. But that's now, getting on to 20 years ago, and I don't have many day-to-day chances to speak German anymore. So this year, I decided to try and be a bit more deliberate about keeping up my German. I recently set myself the challenge to keep it up by properly watching German shows without subtitles. I've at least changed the subtitles to German language subtitles. To be fair, actually, I often have English language subtitles on too. I just like watching TV that way. But if I turn off the German language subtitles, I do lose a few details at the moment. I can still totally understand, but I think it's at the moment beneficial. But my goal is to try by the end of the year to be able to be really good again and be able to watch them without. So that's my current language challenge. I have, of course, made many, many, many language mistakes over the years, but I think they all lead to greater learning and some funny stories. And I do also believe that there are lots and lots of ways your travel experiences are deepened when you know the language. So this combination of things, the benefits of languages and also the fun of making mistakes in languages, these are the two topics that all of my guests today discuss. My first guest is Angela Correll, and she first moved to Italy without knowing much Italian, but then thought she would change that.
Well, the funny thing as I look back on it is I distinctly remember someone asking Jess and I probably, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, can you speak Italian? And I remember we said, yeah, we have some words. And feeling kind of confident in that. And then, I look back now on it and the more you know, the more you don't know. I guess that's the nature of anything. You got to feel a little confident in something just to even give it a shot. Yeah. So around the time we started looking at the house, we saw an opportunity to take some Italian lessons about an hour from where we live in a kind of a community, an old Carnegie library, actually, that had been changed into a place for learning and literacy. So we signed up for 2 6-week courses, beginner and then beginner 2. And I didn't even know how to say I in Italian at that point. I thought I knew a few words. I didn't even know. I couldn't put a sentence together. I didn't know any verbs. I didn't know anything really. And so that gave us a little bit of a framework to work with. And then from there, of course, we did some apps and some different things and started watching movies in Italian with the subtitles just to get more familiar. After that, we did take a couple of classes in a school nearby the little town that we're in. So we did a couple weeks there. So anyway, we've done some structured and then just some kind of being around it and learning and hearing the way people use phrases. And I am by no means, I have survival Italian. I'm still learning and growing. It's very basic, but I can, if I were dropped in Italy, unless it's like Sicily or the South, I might struggle there. Mm-hmm. But if I'm dropped most places from Rome up or so, I would be able to get by. It sounds like a 5-year-old, but I can get by. Yeah. So that's at least encouraging, but we do want to keep learning and keep growing. But I have a really funny story. When I was learning Italian, I had some relatives come over, my sister, two sisters, and one brother-in-law. And so I had looked up, which is always helpful because you know somebody's coming, you know you're going to introduce them to your Italian friends. And so I had looked up the word for brother-in-law. And the word for brother-in-law in Italian is cognato. And so I had been practicing what I was going to, how I was going to introduce my brother-in-law, my sisters. And so anyway, I was with some Italian friends and I said, I introduced my sisters and I said, and this is il mio coniglio, Earl. His name is Earl. And so they just started laughing, and I realized instead of saying cognato, I said coniglio, which basically translates to, this is Earl, my rabbit.
Oh.
Well, they started dying laughing, and I knew as soon as they started laughing, I thought, okay, I said something really wrong. As much as I tried to practice, it was terrible.
In that moment, key moment.
In that moment. But, I think the thing you have to do when you're learning a new language is just be okay with being slightly humiliated half the time.
Yeah.
And I'm shy by nature. And so that's really hard for me because I would rather just be quiet and not say anything than look, ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
But I have learned I have to look ridiculous, and that's okay. So it's okay because they really are forgiving and they so much grace. I mean, especially as I've learned all of the mistakes I was making, people were so gracious. They knew I was trying and they helped me. And I think it really means a lot to another culture when you learn words in their language. And if you're trying to learn the language, I think it means a lot. So I felt and feel very encouraged and inspired by the Italians to keep on that journey because I know the only way truly to connect with people in their heart is through speaking the language. So that's what motivates me more than anything.
But it's funny when you say that people appreciate you learning the language, and I think that's true everywhere except, and I'm guessing the US is pretty same to here, except in English-speaking countries where we expect people to learn English very quickly, and we don't have much patience, do we?
Yes, I think you're so right. In fact, that's a great point because I feel like it's given me great compassion for non-English speakers here in the U.S. Truly.
Yeah.
I just feel such compassion because I look at them and I know how hard it is. I know how their brains are tired every day when they go home after being out with people and trying to communicate. Even simple things like looking at a bill or going to the bank or whatever it is can be so intimidating and overwhelming if you don't have a basic knowledge of the language. And so I think that is putting yourself in the position of being that alien in a foreign land, so to speak, does make you compassionate towards those that are going through the same thing in your own country.
I think that is really, really true. And often native English speakers don't really have this compassion if they haven't had enough experience in another language. I even remember with my then husband, who was German, when we moved here, and I would be out with friends, and a couple of times they said, "Oh, you should stop speaking German together while we're nearby." We were just, discussing something mundane like who was going to get petrol or something. And I would try and say, "Oh, yeah, but it's pretty exhausting for him to have to speak English the whole time." And they definitely didn't really understand. And I think that's a pretty common problem. My next guest is Steve Hoffman, who, by my definition anyway, is a fluent French speaker. And he started off by telling me about a funny language fail he had in France.
I think one of my favorite stories is doesn't reflect very well on me, but and then again it does. I was, as a language learner, I taught myself French. I was a somewhat natural French speaker. The sounds of the language happened to conform fairly easily to my vocal cords for whatever reason, and the shape of my mouth or whatever. So I was always sort of naturally good at it, and then I spent a 9-month stage, a sabbatical of sorts, in Paris during what would have been my junior year of college in the United States. So I was in Paris there and was fanatical about making sure that I said everything perfectly. So I would much rather not say anything than ever say something and make a mistake. It's just how I was wired. I was a perfectionist from the time I was a kid. I would practice entire paragraphs ahead of time, knowing that I was going to step into a shop and have to say something, and it had to be perfect, or I was going to be mortally embarrassed for whatever reason. So later in life, when our family was in southern France on this extended trip that led to my book, I met a friend who had an orchard, and the orchard just completely enchanted me, and I asked him about it, and I would drive by it just to see the trees. It was just this sort of very beautifully maintained, but very simple Mediterranean orchard. And one of the fruits that this man who became a friend eventually, one of the fruits he grew there were persimmons, which in French are called kaki. And I think they're kaki in other languages and in other parts of the world. In
Japan.
The United States, we call them persimmons. Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I always thought that was a Japanese word. I didn't realize that it's not. So I've just learned something.
So anyway, extremely proud of myself. I had bought a persimmon at one of the local markets. My friend was going to come over, and I was going to show off my language skills to him and tell him that I knew all there was to know about his orchard and his fruit. And when he came in, I started talking to him about this caca that I had.
Oh no!
In my head. And he let me go for about 30 seconds, and then finally had to intervene and say, "Steve, you're not referring to what you think you're referring to." So it took me about a week to recover, but I eventually did get over the caca episode, and then did also learn permanently from then forward that persimmons in French are not caca; they are kaki.
Oh dear, that's a very unfortunate error, isn't it?
Yes, it was bad. It was bad, and particularly for me, who
yes.
I was the least prepared for that of anybody I know, and
it was probably a good learning experience. You could pronounce something quite badly and not die.
Yes. And the upshot is, here I am telling that story of all the stories I could tell you about my language acquisition.
Yes.
The one that is the most fun to tell is the kaki kaka story. So clearly, I was in the wrong to be such a perfectionist, and I should have just made more mistakes earlier. I would have been fluent faster. I would have had more fun, certainly, and probably would have made more friends earlier, too. So.
Yeah, but it's a very difficult part of language learning, and you're not alone in not wanting to make mistakes. I mean, that's just something that is human nature for most of us.
Absolutely. I think there's two types. There is the kind that just sort of plunges into the language kind of joyfully and unselfconsciously and makes lots of mistakes and gets embarrassed but doesn't really let it bother them. And then there are the strivers, the perfectionists, and I happen to be one of those. It worked out well. I mean, in the end, my perfectionism led to eventually, probably longer than ideally it would have taken, but eventually it did lead to speaking the language well enough that it started resembling actual fluency. And that is part of what got us so deep into this part of southern France that we settled in, that we actually had, we actually made true friends, and we had experiences that in many cases only people who've lived there for a long time or grew up there would have. And the key, the passageway to those experiences was definitely my early insistence on speaking very, very well. So it's a mixed bag. You at some point you accept who you are and how you do things. And yes, in theory, I might have wished to be a little bit more open-hearted about learning languages earlier. And yet there's a way in which I don't regret it, because it got me that experience in the end.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think it depends on your goals for your language, and you're right, your individual personality. I speak German. If I speak quickly in a noisy room, I speak German fluently, but
Right, yeah.
I'm not perfectionistic at all, which is kind of a downfall, and I almost regret it. So, the German grammar has a lot of intricacies with, is it der, die, das, den, dem,
Yes.
and I actually don't care very much about. I realize, it can make a difference to the meaning, blah blah blah. I understand, but if you speak quickly enough,
sorry, Amanda, that's actually life and death. Just so you know. My wife, Mary Jo, and I have an ongoing discussion about this, which is she basically says a discussion / conflict.
Yes.
Minor, certainly, but she says, "Steve, you are fluent in French. Will you just please stop and just tell people you're fluent in French?" And I'm like, I'm conversational. I'm good at it, but I'm not fluent. And she just gets really, really frustrated with that. And it's so my definition of fluency is, and of course, this doesn't convince her of anything and it makes her maybe even more upset. But my definition of fluency is that, you take your car to the auto mechanic and you tell them what you think is wrong. And then you get on the phone with your best friend and tell jokes and talk politics. And I can have a competent conversation on most topics that would come up in a given week or month in French in France. But I feel like true fluency, you have that specialized vocabulary. You can talk baby talk to your child. I mean, that's an example. I was Mr. Mom with our daughter. So for the first 4 years of our daughter's life, my wife was working as an engineer. She had my degree was in French, Greek, and English, so you can imagine the employable skills that I had after I graduated from university. So I was Mr. Mom at home with my daughter, and one of the things I thought was, I have this wonderful opportunity to raise a bilingual child, so I'm going to speak to our daughter in French. And at some point, very early on, I realized I couldn't talk baby talk to her.
Yeah, interesting.
That was going to be a barrier, and that was going to be an emotional, psychic barrier that I wasn't willing to put up. But it was a reminder, again, of what fluency really means. I think children who grew up in bilingual households where the parents speaking the two different languages are natural speakers, are born in that language. That's one thing. But trying to raise a child in a second language when you're not surrounded by that language, it might have been different if we were in France, but when you're not surrounded by that language in your native country, it is really
hard.
Difficult, if not damaging.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think you're right. Yeah, that's an interesting definition, and I agree. I think it makes sense. People might say I'm fluent in German, but I agree that I'm not. Right. And I always think one of the reasons is I couldn't go. I mean, I worked in Germany, but I worked as an English teacher, so it's cheating. If I was to go and work in a German company and I had to write emails, my emails would be grammatically incorrect because I don't care enough about the fine details. And I'm sure I could learn. And if I learnt that, perhaps I would consider myself closer to fluency. But I can't do that. I know that. And that's I think that's one of my criteria of, language you need on an everyday basis, like you said.
Exactly. Yeah. At some point, it's in the water. You acquire it by spending that much time, and also spending that much time when your brain is still forming, as opposed to in your 40s when it's all locked up.
Yes. It's much, much harder.
So much more difficult.
I know, it's so annoying. Yeah, everyone's definition of fluency in a language is different for sure, but it's an interesting conversation to have. My final guest today is Bex Thomas, and she and her husband spend half the year in France, having bought a home there. So we chatted about some of the difficulties that they've had with language in France as well.
And so much gets lost in translation. My biggest lesson over the last 2 years of doing France for 6 months is, however much you think you understand, don't ever assume. Because actually, oh my goodness, we've got so much wrong assuming that, yes, I understood that. This is what I heard. And it's totally different, totally and wrong and totally wrong. And
Can you give us any examples?
Well, I can give you one where we've got this wonderful mechanic locally, and we were then talking to somebody else, and they said, Fred's had a heart attack. And we were like, oh my goodness, that's awful. Anyway, I wrote a card and everything to his wife and to him, and went down to hand it in to them, and Fred's there working away. So I'm not sure what they said to us, but it definitely wasn't that Fred had a heart attack. But there's been many. That's just a kind of funny.
I mean, I'm
one,
glad that's great news that Fred's fine. But
Fred, yeah. But there's lots of smaller ones where I mean, lots of times where we've gone to buy something, again, the equivalent of Bunnings, and we've said, my husband has said, yes, that I think that's right. And we've gone home and it's totally the wrong thing, because we've obviously assumed what we're hearing is what we maybe want to hear, or I don't know. But yeah, never assume. Google Translate is the best friend.
Yeah, I think that living in a place it stretches your vocabulary beyond any basics, and it's just not what when you learn a language, you don't get taught any of that stuff.
No. And it's interesting, actually. I've asked people that have been here sort of 20 years and are now bilingual, you know, whether I should be going to lessons or I need to be going to lessons. And they say no, because they said, actually, what you're taught is not what the best thing is, to just integrate. And I'm super lucky. I absolutely believe in manifestation, but I don't know how I've been this lucky that in the tiniest place in rural France, there's this most amazing workspace. And what I wanted was, I was starting a podcast and I needed good internet, and ours is dodgy at the house. And suddenly I was walking past to go to the bakery and I was like, oh my goodness, I think this is a workspace. Anyway, It is, and it's beautiful. But also what it means is that I'm surrounded now by French people talking. And so actually I think it is just really getting under the skin of a place and immersing yourself, but really being strong with yourself, not to, even because everybody here can speak English. And that's the challenge, is that then it's easier to default to English. But actually it's staying strong and pushing yourself out of your comfort zone to sometimes sound stupid, because my French is rubbish, but just persevering with it.
Yeah, it's very hard to do, I think. I mean, I learnt German all through school, and then I lived in Germany, but I was teaching English, so, you know, it was harder. Like at work all day, I was speaking English. And it's not until I had a German boyfriend that then finally, and he was like, he would get tired of speaking English. His English wasn't great when we first met. And so then finally I had to speak German a lot. And then after, you know, decades of learning, then suddenly I was like, oh, okay, now I can kind of speak German compared to before. It's so easy to not do it.
Especially when we're so privileged with English, aren't we? You know, everywhere. It's the global language that everybody, when you're traveling and you're sat around a table and there's somebody from, I don't know, China, somebody from France, somebody from Germany, somebody from Australia, somebody from anywhere else, everybody speaks English because it's the common, you know, yes, it's broken and yes, it's very basic, but it is English. And so we then are privileged in one way, but actually it's then hard to really learn. So many places I go, like the station, or, you know, if you're in Paris or anywhere larger than where we are, you go in and you start to say something and they just revert in English. And I'm like, no, come on, help me learn French. But they don't. Their English is so good that they just want to, you know, it's quicker and easier for them.
Yeah. I had the same experience in Germany so many times. And often I remember when my son was little, and like, because I've been learning so long and, you know, my accent's decent, and so they wouldn't initially do it. But I remember ordering at a restaurant, blah, 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 it was all fine. But then I turned to my son and asked him something in English, and then so they realized, oh, really, you speak English? And then they just wouldn't speak German to me again. I'm like, but we were perfectly fine in German. You know, you know, just because now you know this other piece of information doesn't mean you need to do that. So yeah, it's so frustrating.
No, I've made it. I've really, really tried that I continue on with French. So in that situation, I continue on. And sometimes it's random that you're having I'm speaking French, they're speaking English back to me.
Yeah. But it works out.
Yeah, it works out.
We native English speakers do really have a huge privilege by, well, being native English speakers. It does seem to be a language that gets you through a lot of places, which is almost sad, I think. I don't know. It makes life easy, but I'd rather learn some more as well. Anyway, hopefully lots of food for thought and some fun in that episode. Thank you very much for listening, and a big thanks to my guests. First of all, I chatted with Angela Correll, and you can find out more at angelacorrell.com and look up her book, Restored in Tuscany. You can imagine what that's about. I also chatted with Steve Hoffman, and you can find out more about him at sjrhoffman.com. And he has a book called A Season for That, Lost and Found in the Other Southern France. For both Angela and Steve's books, I'll leave a link in the show notes so you can look them up easily. And lastly, I chatted with Bex Thomas, who runs Feel Good Getaways at feelgood-getaways.com and talks about sabbatical life as well. Lots of cool stuff. So come and chat with us more about your own language learning experiences. Come and join the Thoughtful Travellers groups in Facebook or LinkedIn. And don't forget, you can also read more and support the podcast if you so desire, but there's plenty of free content as well at the Thoughtful Travellers newsletter at Substack at thoughtfultravel.substack.com. A very, very huge and big thank you to the new subscribers I've picked up there lately, the paid subscribers. Massively appreciate your support. Thank you very, very much. All of these details and more are in the show notes, and this episode you'll find them at notaballerina.com/344. As always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.